So, as a means of an introduction then, I am SMI, Sergeant Major Instructor, WO1, Matt Vernon of the Small Arms School Corps. Now, what the Small Arms School Corps are, we're quite strange, we're unique. We are strange as well, you can probably tell that from the way I'm dressed. We're quite unique in that no other army throughout the world has a regiment whose sole purpose is the husbandry of small arms training and also the issuing of our range qualifications that our soldiers use to train for operations with the weapon systems, pyrotechnics and armoured fighting vehicles, which we have currently in the British Army's fleet. Now, you might be asking the question, why has an SASE guy come to brief you about old tanks, new wars? I also like to do a little bit of the history side of life, and it's quite funny, particularly when we're talking about the subject which we're talking about today, that we have very common themes in the weapon systems that we've got. And the old adage of, if it isn't broken, don't fix it, really comes into its own, particularly with armoured fighting vehicles. Now, the story I'm going to tell you today, and that's what all history is, isn't it? It's a story. And if we were thinking about stories, we'd be thinking about a list of things, wouldn't we? We'd be thinking about good and interesting characters, a good story, exotic locations, and aesthetically pleasing. And the story that I'm going to tell you today has got all of that. It's got espionage, it's got windswept deserts, it's got tundra, it's got spies, and it's also, particularly for a Tankfest audience, got a good smattering of extremely rare German tanks in it as well. So I'm absolutely sure quite a lot of the people will be interested in those particular aspects of it. Now, before we go into this story, let's have a little bit of a chat about the context of the environment in which this story, the plot if you like, is going to be set. Now, when we talk about modern conflict, what we're talking about is anything after 1945. Anything after the Allies are victorious against the Axis, the Germans, the Italians, and later stages the Japanese, and they are victorious. And what that time sees is a number of innovations that will change the way in which conflict is conducted from that period. Now, one of the largest things that we'll notice is the American use of atomic weapons in Japan. This completely changes the way, in particular, we conduct ourselves in major peer-on-peer conflicts from that period. But what we also see is a development of vehicles and a development of powers which we've already got. Now, what I mean by this is, in modern conflict, air power really comes into its own and it starts to dominate the battlefield, whether it be at the strategic level or whether it be at the tactical level. Strategic bomber forces, aircraft are dominating that battlefield. But what we also see is a change in the way that armoured fighting vehicles are utilised. When the First and Second World War periods come about, and I know this subject's up for argument, but a great deal of the tasks that tanks were involved in were generally revolving around the support of infantry. In an attack, moving forward, the infantry being given the extra support of that armoured fighting vehicle. What the later stages of the Second World War start to prove is that the tank can operate, in some cases, as a tank hunter, a vehicle that is sent out as mobile artillery with the purpose of destroying other tanks and disrupting other armoured operations on the enemy's front. Now, during that stage, that modern conflict also produces a strategic event, which is that the Allies in particular know that if you are going to be fielding tanks in numbers, you are going to have to produce large numbers of them. The more tanks that you have, the better you can field them, the better you can dominate your enemies. Now, as a consequence of that, when the Second World War comes to an end and we start to move into what we know as the Cold War period, we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of armoured fighting vehicles that have been made in America, Germany, Czechoslovakia and Britain that no longer really have a purpose. Everybody is demob happy. The armies are shrinking down from their wartime sizes to more peacetime occupation forces. We are not expecting, just as we didn't during the First World War, to encounter another conflict as large as the Second World War. And we're entering a period in history where armies are getting smaller, they are getting more defined, they are getting sharper. So as a consequence, large amounts of military vehicles begin to be surplused from the American army, the British army, and also the French, German armies, so that we can find a home for them and try and recoup a little bit of the cost that was put out in the first place of buying them. Now, when we talk about numbers, I'm going to give my story away a little bit here, because I'm going to talk about 4 armoured fighting vehicles. Now, the numbers which I'm going to give you are the universally accepted numbers. They may be a little bit higher, they may be a little bit lower. If we're looking at Shermans, you are looking at over 49,000 Sherman variants were manufactured during the Second World War. If we're looking at T-34s, you've got 57,000 armoured fighting vehicles. Panzer IV, 8,500, and Stugs, 11,000. Particularly with the German vehicles, these vehicles no longer have a purpose. So as a consequence of that, they find themselves on the surplus market. Now, the first time that our very old tanks and our modern wars come about is during the Desert Wars. Now, when we're talking about the Middle Eastern wars, we're in particular looking at the wars or modern conflicts that happened in the Israeli, Jordanian, Egyptian plains, the Sinai, the Golani Heights. Now, I put this slide up as a little bit of a description by what we mean by modern war. When we're talking about the nature of conflict, we know that in the Second World War, the Germans, the British, and the Americans were arming themselves with infantry anti-tank weapons that an infantry section can use to knock out armoured fighting vehicles. Now, during the Desert Wars of the 50s, 60s and 70s, what we start to see is that theme coming through again. In particular, the Soviet-packed armoured forces, such as the Syrians, the Egyptians, they are armed with man-portable anti-tank weapons, which is what you see here. And they're able to bring them up and try and dominate the battlefields around where they are. Now, during this period of modern conflict, the Israelis, when they are formed as a state in 1947, 1948, they realised that they're going to need huge numbers of armoured fighting vehicles to be able to combat this type of threat, because not only are their adversaries probably going to have modern Soviet issued equipment, what they're also going to have is the means to knock out their vehicles utilising infantry anti-tank weapons. So as a consequence of that, they realise that they're going to need huge amounts of vehicles. Now, when we talk about the Middle Eastern wars then, it's quite an interesting photograph that, isn't it? Because if you were to look at that photograph, you would think that is probably 1945, 1946. We've got a Yard Panzer there, an infantry fighting vehicle, mobile artillery. That vehicle is actually in the service of the Syrian armed forces. And that photograph was taken in 1956. So it's a good amount of time after that vehicle has probably reached its usefulness in the German military. Now, when we talk about the Middle Eastern wars, one of the first vehicles that we have to talk about is the Sherman, and in particular the Super Sherman, the M50 that the Israelis field from round about 1954 all the way to the late 1980s, when some of their reserve units were still utilising these vehicles. Now, this is where our espionage bit comes in. This is where our skullduggery bit comes in. When the State of Israel is formed in around about 1947, 1948, they do not have an armoured fleet. They know they're going to need one, and they know that their enemies surround them and they're circling them, looking for that kill. As a consequence of that, Israeli agents are sent all around the world to try and procure tanks. Now, it is decided that because Israel's army is a relatively embryonic army with not a great supply chain, not a great training background, that one of the best vehicles which they could probably get their hands on was the Sherman. It's easy to maintain, it's easy to drive, it's easy to train your crews how to use, and it's also a battle-winning formula. They knew that the Americans and the British had used these armoured fighting vehicles to great success during the Second World War. As a consequence of that, they decide that the Sherman is probably the tank for them. Now, there are hundreds of thousands of Sherman tanks sat in scrapyards, sat in depots, sat parked where they'd been last used by the victorious Allies, and nobody really wants them anymore. So they can be procured relatively cheaply. Now, when they come into Israeli service, they make a number of modifications to the wartime vehicles. They redo the suspension. And most importantly, they realise that the Sherman's armament isn't as potent as is going to be required for the modern conflicts which they're going to be employing these vehicles in. As a consequence of this, what the Israelis do is they speak to a number of other nations about supplying guns for their re-turreted Shermans. Now, this is really difficult for them because at this stage, Israel is facing huge embargoes on which types of military equipment that they can buy, and one of the only nations that will supply the Israelis are the French. Now, there is a couple of reasons for this. The first one is that the French are trying as best as they can to rebuild their country and their military capability. So as a consequence, their reps are sent all over the world to send or to sell their military equipment. There is also an espionage side to it, because France realises that one of the potential enemies of Israel is going to be Syria. They have a bit of a beef with Syria, it being a former French colony, etc., etc. They have also, particularly in the 1950s, been shown the back of their trousers by Nasser's Egyptian government in the Suez crisis, and as a consequence of that, they are keen to supply a friendly Middle Eastern power with armoured fighting vehicles. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, I suppose, is the adage that we could add to this. Now, what the Israelis do, they first send advisors to France and they look at their AMX-13 tank. They like the tank, they like the armament, and they also love the fact that the French are willing to sell them to the Israelis at this stage. And what they do is they buy a couple of the vehicles. When they get them back and they start to evaluate their capability, they realise that because the AMX-13 is a relatively lightly armoured tank, it's not going to suit the rigours of the types of battles which they're going into. However, what they do realise is they love the gun that the AMX-75 has on it, and that particular gun is a development of the 75mm that the Panther tank of the Second World War has on it. What they then decide to do is mount it into a turret that can be fitted to the Sherman. And what they end up with is the M51 Super Sherman. Now, as you can see, there is a quite marked development and modification of the original Sherman. One of the main problems that they have with the M50 Sherman, with the M50's turret, is that because the gun's recoil and calibre are larger than its original armament, it tends to pivot the turret. So as a consequence, they weld lead weights to the rear of the turret, enabling the gun to be fired and not disturb the vehicle too much. Now, this particular vehicle is beloved in Israeli service, and it goes on to serve, as I mentioned, all the way up to the 1980s. There is a further development of it, the M51 Super Sherman, with an up-gunning, with a new French artillery piece that they place into the barrel. But the chassis of the vehicle is changed very little. The armament inside the vehicle, the way the vehicle operates, is basically a World War II American Sherman vehicle. And this tank is used all the way up into the modern conflicts. And it's in the 1967 war that this tank particularly comes into its own. Now, what you can see here is the upgraded version of it. The new version that I believe may be getting brought out today, so you can have a little look at it. Now, this tank, as I mentioned, is beloved in in Israeli military service. What we also need to look at are what kind of tanks are Israel's enemies fielding at this time. Now, I'm going to put a photograph up on here, and everybody would like to have a guess when they think it is. Does that look like the Western Front or the Eastern Front circa 1945? Thereabout. We've got German armoured fighting vehicles moving across, and we've got their support vehicles. What's amazing is this photograph was taken in 1967. German armoured fighting vehicles, in this particular case, the Panzer IV, are being used in Syrian service in 1967. Now, you might be thinking, how did the Syrians get their hands on these vehicles? Now, this again is a bit of a sort of espionage, Cold War, interesting story. The Syrians are aware, just as Israel was, that it's more than likely there is going to be a war at some stage in Israel that is going to require armoured fighting vehicles to go into battle. Now, they do not have the kind of funds that is available to Israel. So what they have to do is go scrapyard hunting, very much like the Israelis do, but very much on the lower end of it. And what they realise is that there are large numbers of German fighting vehicles. We're talking Panzer IVs, we're talking Stugs, some rarities like the Jägerpanzer, but that they're sat in scrapyards in France, battlefield recovery pieces. They're also sat in Czechoslovakia, that when the Soviets captured large amounts of armoured vehicles from the Germans, they had them sat gathering dust for a number of years, and what they decided to do with them was sell them to the Czechs, or give them to the Czechs. The Czechs used them for a number of years, and then started to receive more modern Soviet models, T-34-85s, etc., etc., T-62s, T-55s, that kind of way on. And as a consequence, they decided that they are going to need to get rid of these vehicles rather than just have them in infantry. So as a consequence of that, they are sold to the Syrian government. They also procure large numbers of Stugs and Panzer IVs from Franco's government in Spain. Now, Franco's government bought these vehicles from the Germans in 1942, 1943, and they've been in Spanish service till about 1955, 1956. They are then surplused out to the Syrians. So in essence, what we see, particularly in the wars from about 1955 all the way up to 1967, is two old World War II adversaries, the Sherman, the Panzer IV, fighting it out on the Sinai Desert steeps and up into the Golani Heights. Now, one of the things that we must mention about this is the difference in training. Because overall, there are some rare examples, but overall, the Syrian crews were not as successful with their World War II armoured fighting vehicles as the Israelis were. And that is because of the training regime that the Israelis had in place. They knew that to beat a peer-on-peer enemy with old but still very effective vehicles that the only way to do it is to train your crews well, drill them so that they know what they're doing, and also have a fully functioning recovery and maintenance fleet that follows the armoured vehicles up to the front. Now, when we start to look at the Panzer IVs, what we also see in particularly Egyptian service is our old friend, the T-34. These tanks are used by the Egyptians and in some limited numbers by the Syrians also, but again, what we see with this is relatively old tanks, but upgunned, maintained, brought to the front, but they're not used effectively. Now, one of the problems that they have with these is tactically they're not employed correctly, and unfortunately most of the vehicles that are utilised by them end up in the situation that we have here, where in essence we've got a relatively modern tank, T-34-85, that has been brewed up by an Israeli crew because they know how to use their vehicles better and they know how to bring them into the field. Now, the Israelis, particularly during the later 1960s, 1970s, their spies, their agents, their politicians are sent out and they begin or build a rapport. Now, for the Israelis, this works particularly well because of the fact that we have an oil crisis in the 1960s, 1970s, and it is Israel's often seen as a friend in the Middle East. So a lot of the trade embargoes that are put on Israel, particularly for military equipment, are diminished. And as a start, they start to be supplied with British and American equipment directly from, and we also start to see this particular tank in service with the Israeli military. Now, we know that we've got a Centurion there, and a lot of people think it's a Cold War tank. It is a Cold War tank, but it's actually designed in the middle 1940s, and the earlier models of these vehicles are actually brought to battle or brought to bear by the British in late 1945. Now, this vehicle here becomes mythical in the Israeli system, and they take it to heart, very similar to how they do the Sherman tank. And it's even given its own name, which is the Shuet, which, if there are any Hebrew speakers in the audience, I am really sorry for my terrible pronunciation there. It means whip, and that because it's a very affectionate name for the tank that they have, and they are using these vehicles all the way up to the 1990s. And what you see here is these vehicles being used in the 1980s, the 1990s, and in some respects these vehicles in recovery type vehicles and armoured engineering type vehicles are still being used by the Israelis up to the modern day. Again, we get that adage, if it isn't fixed, if it isn't broken, don't fix it. And if it's cheaper but it's still effective, we can buy more of them, and if we have more of them, they can be used more effectively. It might be a little bit older, their guns might not fire as quickly or as stably as the new armoured fighting vehicles, but we can negate this with training. We can negate this with maintaining our fleets properly, and, as Erwin Rommel said, the man who's got more bullets in his magazine is going to win. And it's the same with the target or with the tank. You have got more of them, you are going to win. Now, as we've spoke about, these vehicles are used extensively in the Middle East, but what we also see, particularly in the later 1980s and early 1990s, are a number of hot wars that occur in Europe. Now, you might be thinking, before I move on, well, what happened to the German tanks that the Syrians had? Unfortunately, that is the fate of most of them. Now, because of the fact that the Syrians knew they weren't going to very effectively use these vehicles with their ill-trained crews, they mostly mounted them on the Sinai as dug-in pillboxes. And up there at this current stage are quite a lot of knocked out Panzer IVs and also Stugs that are rusting away up on the Sinai. And I'm absolutely sure if some of the collectors of the armoured fighting vehicles that are here at Tankfest today could get their hands on them or get into the Sinai, or sorry, the Golani Heights, they would absolutely love them, because in many cases they've been sat untouched since the 1967 conflict. Now, as we move on to our European wars then, as we can see there, we've got quite clearly a T-34 85. Now, these were issued to the Yugoslavian, the Croatian army, and they were extensively used in service during the Bosnian conflicts that we see of the late 1980s, early 1990s. Now, the next photograph that I'm going to put up is quite interesting, I think, because what it shows is that what we're doing is we are taking an old vehicle and we're utilising improvised armour to try and protect that vehicle a little bit more and make it a little bit more effective. Now, during this conflict, just as with the desert conflicts that we spoke about earlier, there are a number of players, all right? We've got the former Soviet Union, and they have flooded the area with modern armoured fighting vehicles. So I find it particularly interesting that the Croatians and the sort of Yugoslavian forces that were out there were still utilising these vehicles and trying to make them as effective as they possibly could. Now here's another example of the improvised types of armour that you see when you're bringing it about. Now, I'm not too sure what's going on with this particular vehicle, to be perfectly honest. It looks to me like the old what do you call it, the sleeping roll mats that the British Army get. I am not too sure how effective they would be in diminishing the effect of modern anti-tank ammunition. However, they do look like they will be able to, you know, at least allow the crew a little bit of protection from small arms. Now, during these conflicts, the fact that, in essence, a 70-year-old tank is still bringing itself to bear and is still being used by the forces, for me, is an astounding revelation, to be perfectly honest, that vehicles that were manufactured so long ago have been able to still be used. Now, I'm going to put up a photograph now that brings our story kind of full circle and all the way. Now, what do we think this is? Have we seen this photograph before? Now, to give a little bit of context to it, this photograph was taken in the Yugoslavian war quite recently, about 2 years ago. Would anyone like to have a stab at what they think that vehicle is? Go on back there. It looks like a Panther, doesn't it? All right. Now, it isn't a Panther, and we can tell by the road wheels and the track arrangement that it's probably one of the worst Panther replicas that has probably ever been used. But it does have a really interesting story. And the reason that I've put it there is because we all know that the armed forces of Ukraine are not using World War II Panther tanks to take on the Russians. But what they are doing, and it's sort of assumed that this is what this vehicle has been used for, is they are being used as decoys. The Ukrainians are rolling them out, they're painting them, they are putting modern composite type armour on them, i.e. cardboard boxes filled with sawdust, to make them look like something else. What they're then doing with those vehicles is they are rolling them out and they are drawing the Russian fire with them. They are then enabling themselves to locate where their enemy, i.e. the Russians' armour, is, and they're either using drones, direct fire weapon systems, or indirect fire weapon systems to bring about that. Now, there are a couple of examples of the Ukrainians doing that, and that's what this particular vehicle was used for, as a decoy to bring out the Russian fire. They have also done it with mascot T-34s. And during the early invasion, we all probably remember seeing the Ukrainians removing the T-34s from their village war memorials, and there was a lot of chat about them using them as actual armoured fighting vehicles. They weren't. They were using them as mobile pillboxes, or they were making composite type, and I think that's the big word here, type armour, sticking it to the sides of the vehicles and utilising them as decoys so that the Russians were not knocking out their frontline T-62s, T-72s, because they knew they had to protect them. And that's why they were using these type of decoy vehicles to better bring that about. Now, I think that's interesting because although these vehicles are not being used as active fighting vehicles, it kind of brings our story full circle, doesn't it? Because what it shows is that a type 70-year-old vehicle can be used in modern conflict, if not directly, but indirectly, to draw the fire of our enemies. Now, my final point on this being that when we get back to the Sherman, the Super Shermans of the Israeli army were sold to the Bolivian and Chilean army, and they were still in service up until 2013 with the Bolivian army. So those vehicles, the original hulls being manufactured in the Second World War, were still being used in 2013. I guess it shows that if you make something right, you look after it, you're going to have it for the most of its career. Now, at this stage, what I would like to say is I normally do questions, but what I will do, because I know we've not got the microphone guys out today, if anybody, oh, we have got the microphone guys out, so I'd like to ask, has anybody got any questions that they'd like to ask about anything during this presentation? One over there. There's one over there, I think, man.
What I will say,
it's more a point rather than a question, which is, obviously vehicles will wear out, but one thing that I've noticed that was used in the Second World War and well into the modern day is the turrets are often then used as pillboxes. I don't know what the oldest one you've come across of that.
I think it would probably be T-34 ones, I think, because they were used extensively in the Balkan Wars in that sort of period, and particularly all the way along, you know. And often what they mounted them, kind of what the Germans did during the later stage of the Second World War, rather than have an armoured fighter vehicle, they just mount them on a concrete plinth.